A blade catches moonlight in a darkened forest. The huntress doesn't speak, she doesn't need to. Her movements tell the story, fluid, lethal, born from survival. This isn't the gleaming fantasy of kingdoms and courtly intrigue. This is primal, raw, a world where mercy is weakness, and the strong devour the weak without ceremony. When Red Sonja rips the control device from a Cyclops and turns it against the tyrant who enslaved them both, you realize this movie isn't interested in playing it safe. D225 brings us not just another sword and sorcery retelling, but a reckoning with the genre itself. After decades of development, hell, false starts, and canceled attempts, Red Sonja finally returns to the screen, and she's brought blood, fury, and a surprisingly gritty edge with her. Directed by M.J. Bassett, known for her unflinching work on Solomon Kane and Rogue, this isn't the sanitized fantasy spectacle you might expect. It's rated R for strong, bloody violence, and that rating isn't decoration, it's a promise. The character herself carries heavy legacy. Created by Robert E. Howard and adapted by Roy Thomas, Red Sonja has lived through comic book panels, pulp magazines, and a notorious 1985 film that didn't quite capture her essence. For 50 years, she's been the she-devil with a sword, a warrior who refuses to bow to kings, gods, or expectations. Now, with Matilda Lutz wielding that iconic blade, the question becomes, can a modern adaptation honor the savage simplicity of Howard's Hyborian age while crafting something genuinely fresh? Here's what makes this version different. The film opens in Hyrkania, Sonja's homeland, during a brutal invasion that slaughters her people and scatters the survivors like ashes. She's not a chosen one, blessed by prophecy. She's a refugee, separated from her tribe, worshipping the forest goddess Ashera while hunting for any remnant of her lost culture. Years pass. Mercenaries invade her forest sanctuary, capturing exotic creatures for gladiator games, and when Sonja attacks them as punishment for their cruelty, she's captured herself, dragged to the capital city to fight for the entertainment of Emperor Dragan. This setup matters because it establishes a world with specific rules. There's no grand quest handed down from wise mentors. No magic sword waiting in a stone. Sonja becomes a warrior because circumstances give her no alternative. The film strips away the romanticized fantasy trappings and asks, what would it actually look like if a lone survivor had to claw her way from slavery to rebellion? The answer involves cyclopes, schizophrenic assassins, and a final showdown where gods intervene. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The world building here draws from the sword and sorcery tradition Robert E. Howard pioneered with Conan, but filtered through a 2025 sensibility that understands audiences have seen decades of fantasy since the original Red Sonja comics. Hyrkania isn't just a name on a map, it's a specific culture with religious practices, the worship of Ashera, social structures, the tribal organization, and a tragic history, the massacre that opens the film. When Sonja searches for other Hyrkanians throughout the story, she's not just looking for allies, she's trying to preserve a people on the brink of extinction. Emperor Dragan serves as the film's central antagonist, but he's more than a mustache-twirling villain. Robert Sheehan plays him as a tyrant obsessed with power, collecting exotic creatures for his gladiator games while searching for a holy book that could grant him dominion over the land. His relationship with Dark Annisia, his deadly consort who suffers from schizophrenia, adds psychological complexity to what could have been a straightforward revenge plot. When the film reveals that Dragan caused Annisia's mental illness through fake medicines, manipulating her devotion to use her as a weapon, the story gains a disturbing dimension that elevates it beyond simple good versus evil dynamics. The gladiator games themselves function as both spectacle and social commentary. Sonja fights alongside enslaved warriors against creatures controlled by Dragan's technological devices, a detail that suggests this fantasy world isn't purely medieval but incorporates elements of advanced, perhaps ancient, technology. When Sonja rips the device from the Cyclops and convinces the creature that Dragan is the true enemy, she's not just winning a fight. She's demonstrating the film's central philosophy. The real monsters are those who enslave and manipulate, not the beasts they control. This brings us to the film's ambitious scope. After escaping the gladiator pits, Sonja doesn't become a lone wanderer seeking personal vengeance. She rallies the escaped slave fighters, creating an army of outcasts. They retreat to the mountains, pursued by Dragan's forces and the relentless Annisia, who's been promised marriage if she brings back Sonja's head. The tactical maneuvering that follows, the plan to attack the town supplying Dragan with creatures, the reunion with missing Hyrkanians who possess the second half of the holy book Dragan seeks, transforms the story from personal revenge into something larger, a war for the survival of a people and the overthrow of a tyrant. Fantasy films in 2025 face specific challenges. Audiences have been saturated with CGI spectacle, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe's cosmic battles to Game of Thrones' dragons and White Walkers. The bar for impressive has been raised astronomically. Red Sonja navigates this by emphasizing practical action and visceral violence over digital excess. When the film depicts Sonja's combat skills, it leans into Matilda Lutz's physical performance rather than relying solely on visual effects. The R rating allows for consequences: blood that stays on blades, wounds that matter, deaths that feel earned rather than sanitized. But what really sets this adaptation apart is its willingness to embrace the mythological alongside the brutal. When Sonja is mortally wounded in combat with Annisia, her horse, yes, her horse knocks the assassin away and carries Sonja to the statue of Ashera deep in the forest. In near-death delirium, Sonja encounters the goddess in the guise of her dead mother. Ashera heals her and sends her back to battle with a divine mandate: bring justice to evildoers. This sequence could have felt cheesy or deus ex machina, but it works because the film has carefully established Sonja's religious devotion from the opening scenes. Her faith isn't decoration, it's the spiritual foundation that sustains her through trauma. The production itself reflects commitment to the material. Filmed in Bulgaria and Greece, using locations that provide authentic ancient world atmosphere, the movie doesn't try to green screen its way through every scene. Director M.J. Bassett brings experience with gritty action from her previous work, and cinematographer Lorenzo Senatore creates a visual palette that emphasizes earth tones, shadow, and firelight over the bright, polished look of many modern fantasy films. The score by Sonia Belousova and Giona Ostinelli aims for something primal, pounding percussion and haunting vocals that evoke ancient battle hymns rather than orchestral bombast. Context matters here. The original 1985 Red Sonja film starring Brigitte Nielsen has become something of a cult curiosity, remembered more for its campy excesses than its storytelling. For years, Hollywood attempted reboots that never materialized, with various directors and actresses attached to projects that collapsed before filming. The fact that this 2025 version exists at all represents persistence bordering on obsession. Hannah John Kamen was initially cast, with Joey Soloway directing and co-writing, but the project underwent extensive creative retooling before Bassett and Lutz took over. That turbulent production history could have resulted in a compromised, committee-designed mess. Instead, the final film feels surprisingly focused, as if the extended development period allowed everyone involved to figure out exactly what story they wanted to tell. The cast surrounding Lutz brings unexpected depth. Wallace Day's portrayal of Annisia could have been a one-note villain role, but the character's schizophrenia and the revelation of its cause adds tragic dimension. Robert Sheehan's Dragan walks the line between imperious ruler and desperate schemer. Rona Mitra, Michael Bisping, and Martin Ford round out the ensemble as Sonja's unlikely allies, each bringing distinct energy to their roles. The chemistry among the escaped slave fighters matters because the film's emotional core rests on this ragtag group choosing solidarity over self-preservation. What's the film really about beneath the sword fights and monsters? Survival, yes. Revenge, certainly. But also community, the way oppressed people can forge bonds stronger than blood when they recognize their shared struggle. When Sonja tries to distance herself from her allies so Dragan will target her alone, they refuse. They insist on staying together, understanding that isolation serves the tyrant's interests. This isn't individualistic chosen one mythology, it's collective resistance, a group of damaged people finding strength in unity. The Hyrkanians who eventually locate Sonja aren't just bringing military reinforcements, they're offering cultural continuity, proof that her people haven't been completely erased. The film's climactic battle delivers on the promise of its R rating. Dragan's forces clash with Sonja's allied warriors in extended combat that doesn't cut away from the carnage. The Hyrkanians are defeated, and Dragan obtains both halves of his coveted holy book, a moment that could feel like defeat but actually sets up the film's most subversive turn. Because while Dragan achieves his goal, his relationship with Annisia implodes. When she learns he caused her schizophrenia as a tool of control, their lovers' quarrel ends with mutual betrayal. They stab each other, and Dragan flees into the wilderness rather than face justice. The conventional fantasy ending would have Sonja personally executing the tyrant. Instead, he escapes, wounded, exposed, reduced to fugitive status. The victory isn't clean or complete, which feels more honest than typical genre resolutions. Red Sonja arrives in 2025 at a fascinating cultural moment. The fantasy genre has been simultaneously elevated and exhausted by prestige television and blockbuster franchises, Audiences have seen everything from intimate character studies to world-ending spectacles. What's left to offer? Perhaps what this film attempts, a return to the pulp roots of sword and sorcery, stripped of pretension, focused on survival rather than destiny. There's no world-saving prophecy here, no ancient bloodline that makes Sonia special beyond her own choices and skills. She's a refugee who becomes a warrior who becomes a leader, not because fate ordained it, but because she refused to stay broken. The limited theatrical release strategy, essentially a single-day event on August 13, 2025, followed quickly by video-on-demand release on August 29, reflects the realities of independent fantasy filmmaking. This isn't a Disney-sized marketing blitz with toys and cross-promotion. Samuel Goldwyn Films distributed it in the United States, Signature Entertainment handled UK and Irish rights, and the film found its audience primarily through digital platforms rather than multiplexes. That distribution model might actually benefit the material. Red Sonja feels more like a discovery than an obligation, a gritty gem for viewers seeking something rougher than the polished fantasy-dominating mainstream releases. The critical reception has been mixed, which is perhaps inevitable for a property this long awaited with such specific audience expectations. Some reviewers praise Matilda Lutz's committed physical performance and the film's willingness to embrace R-rated violence. Others found the plot conventional despite its brutal execution, arguing that the film doesn't reinvent its genre so much as deliver a competent, bloody iteration of familiar themes. Both assessments contain truth. Red Sonja doesn't revolutionize sword and sorcery storytelling, but it does execute that storytelling with conviction and craftsmanship often missing from modern fantasy attempts. What the film understands, and this may be its greatest strength, is that effective genre work doesn't require reinvention. It requires respect. Respect for the audience's intelligence. Respect for the material's potential. Respect for the hard physical work of practical action sequences. When Sonia fights, Matilda Lutz is actually fighting, her movements choreographed but grounded in real exertion rather than CGI enhancement. When characters bleed, the blood looks like blood, not the PG-13 digital smudges that dominate modern action. When Ashera appears to Sonia in her moment of near death, the scene embraces its mythological sincerity rather than winking at the camera with ironic distance. This is a world where gods exist but offer no easy solutions, where weapons break and wounds don't instantly heal, where the villain escapes justice, not through contrived plotting but through the chaos of battle and the imperfection of revenge, where victory means survival, not restoration of some imagined golden age. Hyrkania won't return to what it was before the invasion. But its surviving people can build something new, scarred, diminished, but alive and free. So when that blade catches moonlight in the opening forest scene, what you're seeing is both promise and warning. Promise that this film will deliver the visceral action, its R rating guarantees. Warning that the journey ahead won't offer the comfort of conventional fantasy resolutions. Red Sonja exists in the space between myth and mud, where legends are made not through prophecy, but through the brutal work of staying alive long enough to fight back. And that's where our story truly begins. Red Sonja's story really starts in the ashes of everything she once knew. The invasion of Hyrkania doesn't just function as a backstory. It's the wound that never fully closes, the event that shapes every choice she makes afterward. As her homeland burns and her people scatter, the film sets up a grim reality. There is no cavalry coming, no hidden kingdom ready to rise. The Hyrkanians become scattered remnants in a hostile world, and Sonia emerges from that chaos as someone who has learned to trust the forest, the hunt, and her goddess more than any human promise. Years after that initial devastation, the film shifts its focus to the forest sanctuary Sonia has carved out for herself. The quiet in these early scenes is deliberate. There's a sense of fragile balance, animals moving through thick undergrowth, the sound of wind in the trees, and Sonia stalking through that space like both predator and guardian. Her devotion to Ashera is not presented as abstract faith, it's woven into her daily rituals. She leaves offerings, mutters prayers, and treats the forest as both home and temple. This is where the narrative shows who she's become, someone who has turned survival into a form of worship, merging her reverence for nature with her refusal to bow to human tyrants. That sense of peace cracks the moment mercenaries step into her world. They arrive not as curious travelers, but as industrial intruders, dragging strange creatures out of the underbrush with the help of devices that look more like crude science than traditional fantasy magic. The movie leans into this collision, Sonia's primal, earthbound lifestyle versus a world that happily weaponizes anything it can get its hands on. When she attacks them, it isn't blind rage. It's punishment. She sees them as violators of the forest, of the creatures they're capturing, and by extension, of the goddess she serves. Her ambush is swift, brutally efficient, and powered by the conviction that she is restoring balance rather than starting a war. The film doesn't reward that conviction immediately. Sonya's attempt to defend her world ends with her in chains, dragged to the capital like one more wild thing to be broken. This transition, from forest to city, from hunter to captive, marks the real end of the prologue and the beginning of the story's central conflict. In the capital, the narrative widens. The scale shifts from intimate survival to the machinery of empire, and Emperor Dragan's presence starts to cast a long shadow over every scene. The Gladiator arena becomes the beating heart of this phase of the story. It's where the film synthesizes everything it's been setting up: Sonya's combat skill, Dragan's cruelty, the technological twist on traditional monster fights, and the idea that spectators will cheer for anything as long as it distracts them. Sonia is thrown into this spectacle, alongside other captives, all forced to fight creatures torn from their natural environment and controlled by those strange devices. It's a cruel echo of what happened in her forest, scaled up and turned into public entertainment. The first Gladiator sequence is where the narrative really snaps into place. Sonia is not presented as instantly dominant. She's dangerous, yes, but she's also trying to understand the rules of this new battlefield. The Cyclops fight becomes the key turning point. While the crowd sees a brutal monster, Sonia sees something familiar, another being forced to perform against its will. Instead of just trying to kill it, she focuses on the device that's controlling it. When she tears that device free and turns the Cyclops against the people who enslaved it, the story reveals its central dynamic. This isn't just about one warrior winning fights. It's about someone who knows how to break systems of control from the inside. Dragan's reaction to all of this is crucial. He doesn't just see a strong fighter he wants to keep in his stable. He recognizes a threat. Sonia isn't a typical gladiator. She disrupts his carefully arranged games, undermining his display of total dominance. The Emperor's obsession with power has two main manifestations: the exotic creatures he parades in the arena, and the holy book he's hunting, a relic that promises his dominion over the land. The story positions Sonia as a direct challenge to both. She liberates beasts he thinks he owns, and later becomes a key obstacle to his spiritual ambitions. Allies begin to emerge in this brutal environment. The other enslaved fighters are not faceless cannon fodder. They're distinct personalities with varying levels of hope and resignation. Some are seasoned veterans, others are barely holding themselves together, but most have long since stopped believing in anything beyond the next match. Sonia's presence disrupts that fatalism. Her refusal to behave like a broken captive forces them to reconsider their own boundaries. The film uses small interactions, shared glances, whispered plans, moments of mutual risk to show a slow, fragile trust forming among them. This is also where Dark Annisia moves from ominous presence to active participant in the story. As Dragan's favored killer, her reputation precedes her. The other prisoners know her name. They speak about her the way people talk about a legend they secretly hope never to meet. When she finally appears, the movie doesn't present her as a simple enforcer. Her erratic behavior, emotional instability, and sudden shifts in demeanor all signal that something is deeply wrong beneath the lethal exterior. The early hints of her mental fracture create a sense of dread. This is someone with immense skill and no reliable sense of equilibrium. The transition from survival to planned rebellion happens in stages rather than a single rallying speech. First comes the realization that the arena's chaos can be used. Sonia tests boundaries. How far she can push the guards, how predictable Dragan's routines are, whether the creatures can be turned against their masters the way the Cyclops was. The film uses these small acts as stepping stones to something bigger. Each fight becomes both performance and reconnaissance. Every round is a test, not just of strength, but of the system's vulnerabilities. Eventually, the opportunity for escape presents itself, not as a clean, perfectly timed opening, but as a messy convergence of factors: Dragan's growing fixation on the Holy Book, distractions within the court, and the accumulated tension among the captives. When the explosion finally comes and the slave fighters break out of their confines, the sequence feels earned. They're not escaping because the script demands it at a specific runtime. They're escaping because they've learned, adapted, and finally decided that the cost of staying is worse than the risk of running. The escape isn't a neat victory. Not everyone makes it. The film is careful to show casualties, missed chances, and the sheer chaos of trying to push through guards, beasts, and the city's labyrinthine layout all at once. Sonia emerges as a de facto leader, not because she asked for the role, but because in every frantic decision, where to turn, when to double back, whether to save someone or press forward, Other people instinctively follow her lead. The story quietly confirms what the opening forest sequence implied. She thinks like a hunter, even when the terrain shifts from trees and rocks to stone and steel. Once free of the city, the escaped fighters face a harsh truth. Liberation from chains doesn't automatically equal safety. They regroup in the mountain region, far from Dragan's immediate reach, but not beyond his ambition. These scenes mark the transition into early Act 2, where the narrative starts thinking in terms of strategy rather than pure survival. The group must decide what they are now. Are they just fugitives who got lucky, or are they something more dangerous, a nucleus for a larger rebellion? Sonya's instinct is to minimize collateral damage. She knows Dragan will retaliate, and she doesn't want that retaliation to fall on people who had nothing to do with her choices. Her first impulse is to leave, to draw the danger toward herself and away from the others. That self-isolation is consistent with the way she's been living since Hyrkania fell, alone, relying on her own strength, convinced that attachment only leads to more loss. The story could easily have let her follow that lone wolf path, but this is where the escaped fighters push back. Their refusal to let her go marks a subtle but vital shift in the story's emotional logic. It's the moment the film suggests that community isn't just an optional upgrade to individual survival, it's the only way to mount a serious challenge to power on Dragan's scale. The army of outcasts that forms in the mountains is not built on shared heritage or long histories together. It's built on shared trauma and a hard-earned understanding that the Empire will hunt them down one by one if they don't stand together. Strategically, the rebels understand they can't win by simply waiting for Dragan's forces to find them. That would turn them back into prey, trapped in a defensive posture they can't maintain. So the plan evolves. They decide to strike at the supply line that keeps Dragan's monstrous arsenal stocked. The town responsible for capturing and delivering exotic creatures to the capital becomes their first major target. It's a smart choice, both narratively and tactically. The attack serves multiple purposes. It cuts off Dragan's supply of new beasts, sends a message to anyone profiting from his cruelty, and gives Sonya's army a chance to test itself in open combat rather than contained arena battles. This raid is more than just another action set piece. It showcases the different skills within the group. Some fighters are better at close-quarters combat. Others excel at ambushes or ranged attacks, and a few have enough experience with the Empire's logistics to identify which buildings and records are actually worth burning. The operation isn't flawless, but it's effective, and it proves that these former slaves can function as a coordinated fighting force rather than a desperate mob. In terms of story structure, it's the early Act 2 victory that gives the characters and the audience hope that something bigger might be possible. In the middle of this momentum, another threat resurfaces. The Hyrkanians Sonia thought she had lost forever. News reaches the rebels that survivors from her homeland still exist, not just as scattered individuals, but as a group that has managed to hold on to pieces of their culture and history. For Sonia, this isn't just a tactical development, it's an emotional shock. The identity she's constructed for herself, last of her kind, sole torchbearer of a destroyed people, starts to crack. If there are others, then the burden she's been carrying alone might not have to stay on her shoulders. The narrative uses the search for these Hyrkanians to deepen the stakes. The holy book Dragan is obsessed with turns out to be incomplete, and the missing half is in the hands of Sonya's surviving people. That revelation intertwines multiple threads at once. The spiritual, political, and personal elements of the story fuse into a single objective. Finding the Hyrkanians isn't just about Sonia reconnecting with her roots, it's about preventing Dragan from acquiring the last piece of a tool he believes will cement his dominion. Suddenly, the rebels aren't just fighting a tyrant's army, they're racing him for control of an artifact that could shift the balance of power in the entire world. By the time early Act 2 solidifies, the film has transformed its premise several times. It starts as a tale of invasion and survival, shifts into a brutal gladiatorial saga, then evolves into a mountain-based rebellion led by an unlikely coalition of former slaves and a warrior priestess of the forest. Each step builds on the last rather than replacing it. The trauma of Hyrkania fuels Sonya's hatred of Dragan's empire. The arena teaches her how to exploit the system's weak points. The escape proves that cooperation among the oppressed can succeed. The mountain camp and the raid on the supply town demonstrate that this cooperation can grow into something resembling an organized resistance. Through all of this, the story maintains a tight focus on cause and effect. Dragan's cruelty in the arena directly creates the fighters who will later become his most dangerous enemies. His use of technology to control beasts inspires Sonya's strategy of turning that technology against him. His obsession with the Holy Book leads him to chase both Sonia and the Hyrkanians, unintentionally pushing them toward each other. The film doesn't frame evil as random or abstract. It shows how the structures of power produce the very forces that eventually threaten to topple them. By the end of this stretch of the story, Sonia has gone from isolated survivor to frontline leader of a fragile but determined rebellion. She has rediscovered the possibility that her people might endure. She has turned former victims into soldiers who fight not just to stay alive, but to change the conditions that made their suffering possible. And she has drawn Emperor Dragan's attention in the worst possible way, not as a nuisance to be punished, but as a genuine threat to his vision of total control. That's the turning point where the narrative tightens its grip. The lines are drawn, the pieces are on the board. And the conflict that began in the ruins of Hyrkania is about to evolve into a war that will test Sonia's faith, her alliances, and the limits of how much blood one woman can spill in the name of justice. If you want, the next segment can focus on the rest of the story. Arc, late Act 2, Act 3 resolution, or shift into a dedicated character section starting with Red Sonja herself. The moment Sonia learns that Hyrkanian survivors are out there, the narrative shifts from defensive resistance to a race against time. She is no longer just trying to hurt Dragan's regime, she's trying to reach the last fragments of her culture before he does. That urgency threads through the second half of the plot. Every decision, where to move the camp, who to send on scouting missions, which towns to approach, is shadowed by the knowledge that Dragan's agents are also searching. The holy book he wants, split into two halves, becomes the focal point of that race. One half is already in his possession, and the other is held by the surviving Hyrkanians. Sonia has spent years believing we're gone. Dark Annisia, meanwhile, grows more dangerous as the story progresses. She isn't just a hired blade, she's a woman whose mind has been fractured, whose loyalty to Dragan has been engineered through manipulation and false medicine. Her schizophrenia manifests in abrupt shifts, tenderness snapping into violence, certainty dissolving into paranoid doubt. That instability makes her terrifying on the battlefield, where unpredictability can be as deadly as skill. She is promised marriage if she delivers Sonia's head, a reward that twists affection, coercion, and exploitation into one toxic knot. As the film moves into late Act 2, Annisia's pursuit takes on the feel of a personal haunting. Wherever Sonia goes, the threat of this unstable killer lingers just behind her. While the rebels fortify their mountain stronghold and plan their next moves, Dragan consolidates power in quieter, more insidious ways. He pursues the remaining half of the Holy Book through informants, spies, and sheer intimidation, leveraging his control over cities and trade routes. The text itself is treated as more than a religious artifact, it's a symbol of legitimacy and a potential tool for supernatural domination. Dragan believes that once reunited, the book will grant him spiritual authority over the land, allowing him to convert his physical rule into something closer to divine right. That belief drives him harder than any simple desire for wealth or territory. Sonia's forces, though growing, are still outmatched. Their early success crippling Dragan's supply of creatures doesn't erase the vast gap in manpower and resources. Late Act 2 dwells on this tension. They've announced themselves as a real threat, but that visibility makes them a target. Skirmishes on the fringes of their territory test their discipline. Some of the former slaves struggle to adjust to life as part of a disciplined resistance. Others have difficulty believing that they're anything more than fugitives temporarily lucky enough to be breathing free air. The film uses these moments to keep the rebellion grounded in human fragility instead of romanticizing it as flawless heroism. Eventually, Sonia's path crosses with the Hyrkanians, who carry the remaining half of the Holy Book. The reunion is not a simple emotional catharsis. Joy at finding familiar faces is complicated by the weight of everything that's been lost. These survivors aren't the same people she remembers from before the invasion. They've been hardened by exile, forced to cling to their identity while living under constant threat. The leaders of this group are wary. They see in Sonia both a fierce protector and a magnet for danger. Giving her their trust, and the sacred artifact they've risked everything to keep safe, is not a foregone conclusion. Still, Sonia represents something they cannot ignore, proof that their spirit didn't die with their homeland. Her reputation as a warrior reaches them before she does, carried by rumor and fear from the arenas and the mountains. When they finally see her in person, the film lets the silence speak first. No grand speeches. Just the weight of recognition between people who share a grief almost too large to articulate. The decision to combine their forces, to merge the Hyrkanians' cultural guardianship with Sonia's military rebellion, becomes the emotional hinge of this section of the story. Dragan, however, is never far behind. His forces press harder, and Annisia's pursuit grows more direct. Late Act 2 is marked by tightening circles. Safe routes become scarce. The Empire's patrols push closer. Attempts to move the Hyrkanians and the rebels together in relative secrecy have to contend with the practical problems of moving so many people through harsh terrain while staying invisible to an enemy with scouts, informants, and the motivation of a cornered predator. Dragan can sense his control slipping, and that makes him more vicious. The clash that follows is not a clean, triumphant battle conveniently placed at the climax. It's a grinding, attritional conflict that stretches across multiple locations and phases. The Hyrkanians and Sonya's army face Dragan's forces in a confrontation that feels like the culmination of every imbalance the story has been building toward. The rebels fight with conviction and ingenuity, but they lack the sheer numbers and resources the Empire can bring to bear. The Hyrkanians, carrying their sacred text, are both strategic asset and obvious target. When the battle tips against them and they fall, the film doesn't spare the audience. Their defeat is brutal. Dragan's soldiers seize the second half of the Holy Book amid the bodies of those who tried to keep it from him. For Sonia, this loss is devastating. The survivors of her people she fought so hard to reach are cut down almost as soon as they join the larger struggle. The artifact they protected for so long ends up in the hands of the very man they feared most. The rebellion is left bruised and diminished, its morale shaken. This isn't the way most fantasy stories handle the "get the special item before the villain does" narrative. Here, the protagonists do everything they can and still fail. Dragan unites the two halves of the book and believes his triumph is finally complete. The aftermath of that defeat pushes the story into its darkest territory. The rebels withdraw, not in organized retreat, but in the stumbling, shell-shocked manner of people who've just seen their best chance collapse. Sonia carries the guilt of that failure like a second weapon. She knows her presence drew Dragan's gaze more intensely toward the Hyrkanians. She knows that her attempt to turn scattered resistance into a coordinated front put a target on everyone involved. Yet the film doesn't frame this as simple miscalculation. The truth is harsher. In a world dominated by an empire like Dragan's, there was never a safe path. Doing nothing would have been another kind of death. Amid this despair, personal fault lines crack wide open. The unstable bond between Dragan and Annisia moves to the forefront. The Emperor's manipulation of her mental state, hinted at earlier, now becomes central. She discovers that the treatments and medicines he claimed would help her were the very things that wrecked her mind. His care was a calculated act of sabotage, breaking her sense of self so he could rebuild her as a weapon he could aim. That revelation detonates whatever twisted loyalty remained. Two of the story's most dangerous figures turn on each other, and their private war becomes another wildfire in an already burning world. Their confrontation is brutal, intimate, and final. They don't argue across a throne room or through intermediaries. They stab each other, not symbolically, but literally and messily, tearing apart the partnership that has fueled so much of the film's violence. Annisia's death is both revenge and tragedy. She was never given the chance to be anything other than what Dragan molded her into. His wounding is significant, but he doesn't fall on the spot. Instead, he flees into the wild, clutching both his injuries and his precious holy book, now complete but surrounded by ruin. While this poisonous relationship collapses, Sonia's path reaches its most personal trial. She and Annisia face each other in combat before the final unraveling of Annisia and Dragan's alliance, and the fight leaves Sonia mortally wounded. The sequence hits differently than earlier battle scenes. This isn't about spectacle. It's about the cost of everything she's taken on. Her body finally fails under the cumulative weight of injury, exhaustion, and relentless conflict. She falls, bleeding out, and the world shrinks to the desperate, panicked motion of those around her. Her horse, acting almost like an extension of her own will, drags her away from the immediate carnage and carries her through the forest toward Ashera's statue. The choice to let an animal rescue her rather than another human fighter reinforces the film's connection between Sonia, nature, and her goddess. Even on the brink of death, she is accompanied by the living world she's always defended. The ride isn't heroic, it's desperate. Her vision blurs, sounds distort, and the line between reality and whatever lies beyond begins to dissolve. At the statue, Sonia's physical collapse becomes a spiritual crossroads. She encounters Ashera in a form that cuts straight into her deepest grief. The goddess appears as Sonia's dead mother. The scene is intimate rather than grand. There are no thunderous proclamations or choirs of celestial voices. Instead, the encounter plays like a conversation between a broken child and the parent she lost, layered over divine presence. Ashera doesn't erase Sonia's pain or pretend the blood spilled so far can be explained away neatly. Instead, she restores Sonia's body and issues a single, clear call: bring justice to the wicked. This resurrection isn't presented as a reset button. Sonia returns to the world with scars, memories, and the full awareness of what's been lost. But she also returns with renewed clarity about what she's fighting for and who she's fighting as. She is no longer just a survivor who happens to be good with a sword. She is a chosen instrument of a goddess who cares deeply about balance and retribution. The film doesn't suddenly shift into religious propaganda, though. It stays grounded in the idea that divine intervention doesn't solve everything. It just gives Sonia one more chance to decide what to do with her rage. Back on the battlefield, the war grinds toward its conclusion. Dragan's forces are weakened by losses, internal betrayal, and the collapse of his partnership with Annisia, but they are still dangerous. The rebels have no guarantee of victory. The Holy Book, now fully in Dragan's hands, adds a spiritual dimension to the threat, yet the film doesn't turn this into a spell-casting showdown. The text represents authority, myth, and the idea that power can be justified by divine sanction. Sonia and her allies oppose that, not with their own sacred text, but with lived resistance, steel, strategy, and the refusal to bend. The final confrontations play out on multiple levels. Physically, the remaining rebels clash with Dragan's loyalists in a battle that reflects how far both sides have come. The fighters Sonia helped free are no longer terrified gladiators. They fight as a cohesive unit, covering each other, exploiting terrain, and using what they learned in the arena to predict and counter Imperial tactics. Emotionally, the fight is about endurance. Every character still standing has lost something irreplaceable: a home, a family, a sense of safety, a stable mind. The film doesn't pretend that victory will magically restore those things. Dragan's fate is deliberately unsatisfying in a conventional sense. After his mutual destruction with Annisia, he doesn't die in a climactic duel against Sonia before the assembled armies. He slips away into the wilderness, wounded and diminished, but alive. That choice undercuts the usual fantasy storybook closure. Evil here isn't neatly contained in a single body that can be killed to reset the world. Tyranny leaves ruins that outlast the tyrant. Even if he never regains his throne, the damage he's done can't simply be reversed. What Sonia wins instead is something far more grounded: space. Space for her people, whoever remains. Space for former slaves to live without collars. Space for the forest to exist without being harvested for spectacle. The rebellion's victory is not declared with crowns or coronations. It looks like survivors tending to their wounded, burying their dead, and deciding to keep living anyway. In story terms, that's the quiet revolution. The Empire's aura of invincibility has been punctured. People have seen that Dragan can bleed, lose, and run. Sonia's role in this new world is left intentionally open-ended. She has become a symbol, the woman who refused to stay broken, who rallied outcasts and remnants into an army capable of shaking an empire. Yet the film doesn't lock her into a throne or a fixed title. She remains a wanderer at heart, someone whose connection to Ashera and to the wild spaces of the world makes her ill-suited to comfortable rule. The hyphen between warrior and leader stays flexible. She can be both when needed, but she is never reduced to a static icon. Thematically, the conclusion reinforces the idea that survival is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of responsibility. Sonia and the others have outlived their oppressor's direct grasp, but now they have to decide what to build in the space his retreat created. The Holy Book, once the object of desperate pursuit, becomes less important than the unwritten future of these people. Sacred texts might shape belief, but lived experience shapes reality. The film ends with characters who understand that distinction, even if they don't have a clear blueprint for what comes next. In the broader arc of late Act 2 and Act 3, Red Sonja refuses the comforting lie that justice always arrives in perfect, symmetrical form. Instead, it presents a world where victories are partial, losses are permanent, and the divine offers strength rather than simple answers. Sonja's journey from hunted refugee to resurrected avenger doesn't tidy up the world's chaos. It makes her one of the few people willing to walk into that chaos with open eyes, a drawn blade, and the hard-earned understanding that true change comes at a cost no prophecy could ever fully explain. Red Sonja begins as a child of catastrophe. The invasion of Hyrkania doesn't just remove her home, it strips away any illusion that the world is fair or that someone else will step in to make things right. That kind of loss reshapes her relationship to power. She doesn't grow up believing in kings or institutions. She learns to trust her own instincts, her goddess, and the land that shelters her more than any human structure ever has. Years later, when we meet her as a fully formed warrior in the forest, she's already internalized a code: protect what's sacred, punish what's parasitic, and never hand control of your life to another person. Her devotion to Ashera is crucial here. It's not a decorative character trait or some abstract faith stapled onto a fighter for flavor. Daily rituals, offerings at the forest shrine, whispered invocations, the way she treats the woods as living presence rather than background, show that this bond is embedded in her routine. When the goddess later appears to her in the guise of her mother, the film is cashing in on trust it has spent the entire first half quietly building. Sonya's belief gives her resilience, but it also makes her vulnerable. She's willing to risk herself for a moral framework that exists beyond immediate survival, which is exactly why she attacks the mercenaries poaching creatures from her forest rather than ignoring them and staying hidden. That choice, fighting back instead of disappearing, defines her. She doesn't pick battles because they're strategically convenient. She picks them because they violate her sense of balance. The attack on the mercenaries is a perfect example. From a purely tactical standpoint, leaving them alone might have been safer. But from her perspective, letting them walk away with bound, terrorized beasts would mean betraying everything she claims to worship. This collision between pragmatism and principle follows her into the arena. Even when she's forced to fight for Dragan's entertainment, she focuses on breaking the devices that enslave creatures rather than simply killing whatever's in front of her. It's the mentality of someone who hates systems of control more than individual opponents. Not interestingly, the film resists framing Sonia as invulnerable. She is competent, but the narrative keeps showing how much effort it takes to keep winning. In the arena, she has to learn the rules on the fly, how the gadgets work, how the guards respond, how far the crowd's bloodlust will go. Her victories come from observation as much as brute force. She doesn't just swing until something dies. She pays attention, adapts, and uses whatever tools Dragan's regime provides against it. The Cyclops fight illustrates this perfectly. She reads the situation, spots the control mechanism, and turns the monster into an ally long enough to turn the tables. That's strategy, not luck. Psychologically, Sonia leans toward isolation even when she's surrounded by people. Her default mode is to stand slightly apart, watching, assessing, ready to act but wary of emotional entanglement. That instinct was born in the ruin of Hyrkania. If everyone you love can vanish in a single act of violence, getting attached starts to feel like inviting another trauma. This is why, after the escape from the arena, her first impulse is to try to protect others by separating herself. She assumes taking the burden alone is the safest path for everyone else. The film challenges that assumption through the other escaped fighters' refusal to let her walk away. Their pushback doesn't instantly cure her of solitude, but it forces her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Trying to carry everything alone can be another way of trying to control outcomes. By insisting that she stay with the group instead of martyring herself, her allies mirror her own values back to her. She taught them that agency matters, that you don't just accept chains because they're familiar. Now they're applying that philosophy to her attempt at self-sacrifice. This feedback loop is where her growth really happens. Leadership stops being something she does from above and becomes something she participates in alongside them. Her relationship to violence also evolves. Early on, she fights because she has to, against invaders, against beasts, against guards. The battles are immediate survival necessities. As the story progresses, the violence acquires a different weight. Once she's leading a rebellion and coordinating raids, every decision to engage carries the knowledge that others will die because she chose to move forward. The raid on the creature supply town, for instance, is not just a tactical blow against Dragan, it's a moral risk she knowingly takes. She's no longer just gambling with her own life. The film lets that weight sit on her shoulders without turning her into a paralyzed commander.us. Her connection to the Hyrkanians who survived the initial invasion hits like a delayed emotional detonation. For years she has been acting as if she is the last real remnant of her people's spirit. Finding out that others have been carrying that same flame in the dark destabilizes her self-image. When they meet, Sonia is forced to reconcile two identities, the lone guardian who built herself in a forest temple and the member of a broken nation whose stories didn't end when she thought they did. That collision doesn't reduce her, it deepens her. She now fights not just for a memory of Hyrkania, but for living people who embody its continuity. Time. The near-fatal confrontation with Annisia strips Sonia down to her core. By the time their blades cross, she's already exhausted emotionally and physically. Losing that fight and bleeding out on her horse's back exposes how fragile even the toughest warrior can be. The resurrection at Ashera's statue is not a power-up in the superhero sense, it's a reclamation. The goddess doesn't make her invincible, she restores what was broken so Sonia can face what's left of this world with full awareness of what it will cost. Coming back from that encounter, Sonia is less haunted by the question of whether she deserves to live and more focused on what she owes to those who can't return. Importantly, the film never cleans her hands. She remains someone who kills because there often isn't another option. The difference by the end is that she understands more clearly what those kills mean. The dead Hyrkanians, the fallen rebels, even twisted figures like Annisia, all of them inform her sense of what justice looks like. It isn't a clean ledger where every wrong gets an exact matching punishment. It's messy, imperfect, and often incomplete. When Dragan escapes into the wilderness, still breathing, Sonia has to live with a world where some evils slip the net. Her strength lies in staying committed anyway. As the dust settles, she stands in a liminal space. She's neither the isolated forest guardian from the early scenes nor a crowned ruler perched above her people. The film leaves her trajectory open, but one thing is clear: she has become a point of reference. Former slaves, scattered Hyrkanians, and anyone who watched the Empire bleed now know that resistance is possible because she proved it. That doesn't make her comfortable. Fame or legend was never the goal. Yet she accepts that being a symbol is part of the burden she carries now. Just another kind of weight added to the sword she refuses to put down. In the end, Red Sonja is defined less by the enemy she defeats and more by the line she refuses to cross. She will endure loneliness, wounds, and failure, but she won't stop fighting systems that reduce living beings to tools or entertainment. Her arc moves from reactive survival to active stewardship of something bigger than herself, a people who still exist, a world that still has sacred spaces, and a justice that may never be perfect, but is worth pursuing with every swing of her blade. Emperor Dragan operates as the film's central architect of misery, but he's not a monster for its own sake. Robert Sheehan plays him with a calculating ambition that feels disturbingly modern, even in a fantasy setting. His obsession with the Holy Book isn't about piety or cultural preservation, it's about legitimacy. He already commands armies, controls cities, and stages brutal spectacles to keep his subjects distracted and fearful. What he craves is the divine sanction that would make his rule unchallengeable, transforming brute force into something that looks like cosmic inevitability. That hunger for spiritual validation makes him more than a standard tyrant. He's someone who understands that power needs narratives to sustain itself. His relationship with Dark Annisia exposes the cruelty beneath his public grandeur. She isn't just his enforcer, she's his experiment in control. The revelation that Dragan deliberately destroyed her mental stability through fake medicines reframes every earlier scene where she appeared erratic or unhinged. What looked like personal instability was actually weaponized trauma, carefully engineered by someone who recognized her potential and decided that breaking her mind was an acceptable cost for gaining a perfect killer. The film doesn't shy away from the gendered implications of this dynamic. A powerful man manipulating a woman's sense of reality, promising love and partnership while systematically undermining her autonomy, echoes abusive patterns that extend far beyond fantasy worlds. Annisia herself, portrayed by Wallace Day, becomes one of the film's most tragic figures precisely because of this manipulation. Her schizophrenia manifests in sudden shifts, moments of lucidity collapsing into paranoid fury, tenderness snapping into lethal focus. Day's performance has to navigate these tonal swings without reducing the character to a caricature of mental illness. The film gives her enough scenes where her intelligence and skill shine through to establish that, before Dragan's interference, she was formidable on her own terms. The promise of marriage as she kills Sonia dangles like bait, mixing affection with coercion in a way that makes her both dangerous and pitiable. When Annisia finally learns the truth about what Dragan did to her, the betrayal hits with the force of retroactive horror. Every ounce of loyalty she gave him, every violent act she committed in his name, was built on a foundation of deliberate psychological sabotage. Her turn against him isn't a redemption arc in the traditional sense. There isn't time for her to make amends or find peace. Instead, their final confrontation becomes mutual destruction, both of them stabbing each other in a grotesque parody of intimacy. Annisia dies without ever recovering the person she might have been before Dragan reshaped her brain chemistry. That's a bleak ending, but the film earns it by refusing to sanitize the consequences of sustained psychological abuse. The escaped slave fighters who become Sonia's core allies represent a range of responses to trauma and freedom. Some, like the seasoned gladiators, have learned to compartmentalize horror and focus on immediate survival. They've internalized the arena's logic. Fight hard, stay alive, don't think too far ahead. Others are newer to captivity, still processing the shock of losing their previous lives. A few are broken in ways that never fully heal, carrying injuries both visible and invisible, that limit what they can contribute. The film doesn't pretend that everyone who escapes chains immediately becomes a heroic warrior. Some struggle with the transition from survival mode to coordinated resistance. What binds this disparate group together is shared recognition of what they've endured and a dawning realization that Sonia offers something rare, a leader who doesn't try to become another tyrant. She gives orders when necessary, but she doesn't demand worship or unquestioning obedience. Her authority comes from competence and moral clarity, not from reproducing the dynamics that enslaved them in the first place. When tensions flare within the camp, and they do, Sonia addresses them directly rather than using violence to enforce unity. That approach isn't always clean or efficient, but it reinforces the idea that the rebellion is trying to create something different, not just replace one hierarchy with another. The Hyrkanians who join Sonia late in the story carry their own complex relationship to leadership and loss. They've survived by staying hidden, protecting the fragment of the Holy Book entrusted to them, and maintaining cultural practices even in exile. Their elders are cautious because they've seen what happens when you draw the Empire's attention. Joining Sonia's rebellion means abandoning safety for the slim hope that collective action might change the balance of power. When they choose to fight alongside her, it's not because they're naive about the odds. It's because they recognize that hiding forever isn't survival. It's slow erasure.us. The bond between Sonia and these survivors is complicated by guilt and responsibility. She knows her presence increases the danger they face. They know that without her, Dragan would still hunt them eventually. The battle that results in the Hyrkanians' defeat and the loss of their portion of the Holy Book becomes a brutal referendum on whether collective action was worth the risk. The film doesn't provide a comforting answer. The Hyrkanians die fighting for autonomy rather than fading into obscurity, but that doesn't make their deaths noble in a way that erases the pain. Their sacrifice matters, but it doesn't redeem the horror of watching another generation of her people cut down ... Sonia's horse deserves mention as more than background detail. In a film filled with elaborate CGI creatures and gladiatorial monsters, this animal functions as the quiet constant in her life. When she's mortally wounded by Annisia, it's the horse that drags her to safety, carrying her through the forest to Ashera's statue without command or hesitation. That moment crystallizes the bond between Sonia and the natural world. She doesn't dominate animals through technology or magic. She coexists with them in a way that honors their agency. The horse acts not out of training but out of connection, recognizing her distress and responding instinctively. In a story about systems of control and enslavement, that relationship stands as a quiet counterpoint, trust built through respect rather than coercion. The soldiers and functionaries who serve Dragan's empire are largely faceless, but their presence raises questions the film doesn't fully answer. How many of them believe in his rule versus simply fear the consequences of disobedience? How complicit are they in the atrocities staged for public entertainment? The arena guards, the creature handlers, the city patrols, all of them enable the system, yet the story doesn't have time to explore their individual motivations. That's a narrative choice rather than an oversight. The focus stays on the people actively resisting, not on humanizing every cog in the oppressive machine. Still, the occasional glimpse of a guard hesitating or a handler showing reluctance suggests that not everyone in Dragan's service is a true believer. Ashera, the forest goddess, exists at the intersection of the spiritual and the tangible. She isn't an abstract concept Sonia prays to in moments of desperation. She manifests visibly, intervening at the moment Sonia would otherwise bleed out in the dirt. Appearing as Sonia's dead mother adds emotional layers to the divine encounter. It's not just a god issuing commands to a mortal warrior, it's the blending of personal grief, ancestral connection, and religious devotion into a single transformative moment. Ashera's message is straightforward: bring justice to evildoers. That directive doesn't come with detailed instructions or guarantees of success. It's a mandate that trusts Sonia to interpret and execute based on her own understanding of balance.ut. The decision to have the goddess heal and resurrect Sonia rather than simply inspiring her to keep fighting changes the story's stakes. This isn't about willpower overcoming injury through sheer determination. Sonia literally dies and is brought back. That divine intervention marks her as chosen in a concrete, undeniable way, yet the film doesn't use that status to make her invincible afterward. She returns to battle still capable of being wounded, exhausted, and overwhelmed. The resurrection grants her another chance, not omnipotence. It's a theological gesture that matters most for what it says about Ashera's investment in the outcome. The goddess cares enough about justice in this world to intervene directly when her chosen instrument falls. The broader ensemble, mercenaries, townspeople, minor characters who drift in and out of scenes, collectively paint a picture of a world where survival often means moral compromise. Not everyone who aids Dragan does so enthusiastically. And not everyone who helps the rebels does so selflessly. Some offer assistance because they've been personally wronged by the Empire. Others hedge their bets, providing limited aid while keeping channels open to both sides. The film doesn't punish these ambiguous figures with narrative contempt. It acknowledges that in a world dominated by imperial violence, pure heroism is a luxury most people can't afford. What the supporting cast ultimately does is complicate Sonya's journey. If every ally were selfless and every enemy purely wicked, her choices would be simpler. Instead, she navigates a landscape populated by broken people, manipulated soldiers, traumatized survivors, and reluctant resistors. Her ability to hold that complexity without collapsing into cynicism is part of what makes her effective. She recognizes Annisia as both threat and victim. She understands that Dragan soldiers might be coerced rather than ideologically committed. She sees the Hyrkanians' hesitation and validates it instead of demanding blind courage. By the time the main conflicts resolve, Dragan fleeing into exile, Annisia dead, the rebellion battered but intact, the surviving characters are irrevocably changed. The escaped fighters who once believed they had no future beyond the arena now carry the responsibility of shaping what comes next. The remaining Hyrkanians, fewer than ever, must decide whether to continue the fight or focus on preservation. And Sonia herself stands at the center of this fractured coalition, no longer just a warrior but a symbol of what refusal looks like in the face of overwhelming power. The film's treatment of these relationships, mentor and student, abuser and victim, leader and follower, goddess and mortal, resists easy categorization. Not every bond is healthy. Not every alliance lasts. But together, these characters create a portrait of a world where change happens through messy, painful, collaborative effort rather than the solitary heroism of a single chosen warrior. Sonia may be the narrative spine, but the flesh around that spine is made up of people whose scars, choices, and sacrifices give the story its weight. M.J. Bassett's direction establishes the film's visual grammar from the opening frames. Known for her work on Solomon Kane and the Ash vs. Evil Dead series, Bassett brings an understanding of how to shoot action that feels physical, rather than digitally choreographed. Her camera doesn't float weightlessly through fight scenes. It stays grounded, tracking movement with a handheld urgency that places the viewer inside the chaos, rather than watching from an omniscient distance. When Sonia swings her sword, the frame emphasizes the arc of the blade, the shift of her weight, and the impact when steel meets flesh. That commitment to tangible violence is central to the film's aesthetic identity. The decision to shoot on location in Bulgaria and Greece, rather than relying on green screen environments, pays immediate dividends. The forests where Sonia hunts feel like actual wilderness, dense, shadowed, alive with ambient sound. The mountains where the rebels make their stand have the rough, inhospitable texture of real rock and sparse vegetation. Even the cities and arenas, while enhanced with set design and digital extensions, anchor themselves in practical architecture that actors can physically interact with. This approach grounds the fantasy elements in a world that obeys physical laws. When characters run across uneven terrain, you see them adjusting their footing. When they take shelter in caves, the stone walls reflect actual firelight rather than simulated glow. Cinematographer Lorenzo Senatore constructs a visual palette dominated by earth tones, deep shadows, and the warm flicker of torchlight. This isn't the bright, saturated color grading of high fantasy epics where every frame looks like a polished painting. Instead, the image feels weathered. Dust clings to clothing. Sweat and blood leave visible marks. The lighting rarely feels artificial. Sunlight filters through tree canopy and dappled patterns, and night scenes embrace darkness rather than cheating visibility for the audience's comfort. That aesthetic choice reinforces the story's focus on survival and scarcity. This is a world where resources are limited and luxury is reserved for tyrants. The R rating isn't just a marketing label. It fundamentally shapes how the film depicts violence. Where a PG-13 fantasy might cut away from fatal wounds or use digital blood that looks more like paint, Red Sonja lingers just long enough to make the consequences clear. Swords leave deep gashes. Bodies crumple with the messy weight of actual death. The Gladiator arena sequences don't sanitize combat into clean choreography. Fighters stumble, get gored, and bleed out in front of cheering crowds. That visceral approach serves the narrative's themes. If the film is about people fighting to reclaim agency from a system that treats them as disposable, the audience needs to feel the cost of that struggle in their gut. Sound design plays a crucial role in establishing atmosphere. The forest scenes are layered with ambient noise, wind through branches, distant animal calls, the crunch of footsteps on undergrowth. These details create a sense of place that extends beyond the visual frame. In the arena, the acoustics shift, echoing crowd noise, the metallic clang of weapons against stone, the guttural roars of creatures. The film uses sound to differentiate environments, helping the audience orient themselves geographically even when cutting between locations rapidly. During quieter moments, the absence of score allows natural sound to dominate, which makes the score's eventual entrance feel earned rather than constant. Speaking of score, composers Sonia Belousova and Giona Ostinelli craft music that emphasizes percussion and primal vocals over orchestral swells. The result feels tribal, ancient, and deliberately removed from the sweeping romanticism of traditional fantasy soundtracks. Drums drive battle sequences with relentless rhythm, while wordless chanting evokes ritual and spirituality without tying the music to any specific cultural tradition. When strings appear, they're used for tension and melancholy rather than triumph. The score doesn't tell the audience how to feel so much as underscore the raw energy already present in the visuals and performances. The production design faces the challenge of creating a fantasy world that feels lived in rather than constructed for the camera. Dragan's capital city blends stone architecture with hints of advanced technology, particularly in the devices used to control creatures in the arena. These gadgets, mechanical collars, restraining mechanisms, suggest a civilization with technical knowledge that doesn't align neatly with medieval fantasy tropes. The design choice adds a layer of world building. This isn't a static medieval Europe analog. It's a culture with its own technological trajectory, using that knowledge to exploit and dominate rather than to uplift. The space feels cramped, oppressive, with limited sightlines and walls stained by years of blood. Spectators crowd into tiered seating that emphasizes their proximity to the violence. This isn't a distant, sanitized entertainment venue. It's intimate brutality, designed to maximize both the performer's vulnerability and the audience's bloodlust. The set design communicates the Empire's values, spectacle built on suffering, public entertainment derived from watching the powerless tear each other apart. The costume design by Sarah Ryan, assuming typical industry roles, though specific credits vary, differentiates characters through practical details rather than ornate fantasy flourishes. Sonya's clothing is functional leather and cloth that allows movement, nothing that would snag on branches or restrict her in combat. Her armor, when she wears it, is minimal and strategically placed to protect vital areas without sacrificing mobility. Dragon's court dresses in finer fabrics and richer colors, but even their garments have a utilitarian edge. This is an empire built on conquest, not courtly refinement. Annisia's costumes reflect her dual nature, elegant enough to move through Dragon's inner circle, but always ready for violence, with concealed weapons and clothing that won't impede her when she attacks. The creature design balances practical effects with CGI enhancement. The Cyclops that Sonia fights in the arena is a hybrid creation, physical costume work, combined with digital facial animation to achieve expressions and scale beyond what a performer in a suit could deliver. The design philosophy seems to favor tangible elements wherever possible, using digital effects to augment rather than replace practical work. Other creatures seen briefly throughout the film follow a similar pattern, grounded in biological plausibility even when fantastical, avoiding the overly stylized look that can make CGI monsters feel disconnected from live-action environments. Editing by Dan Lowndes. Equivalent, depending on actual credits, serves the story's pacing needs without overindulging in action sequences are cut to maintain spatial clarity. Audiences can track who is where, which direction attacks come from, and how combatants move through the environment. That clarity is harder to achieve than it sounds. Many modern action films rely on quick cuts to hide choreography weaknesses or create false energy. Red Sonja's action editing trusts the performers and stunt coordinators enough to let shots breathe, showing the full arc of a sword swing or the setup of a tactical maneuver. The film's structure uses cross-cutting during the late Act 2 and Act 3 conflicts to build tension across multiple fronts. While Sonja's forces engage Dragan's army, the film also tracks Annisia's approach, Dragan's scheming with the Holy Book, and the internal dynamics among the rebels. These parallel threads are woven together with editing that maintains momentum without overwhelming the viewer. Each thread gets enough screen time to remain emotionally relevant, and the cuts between them often emphasize thematic parallels. Sonja fighting for agency, while Dragan manipulates tools of control, for instance. Color grading throughout the film maintains consistency even as environments shift. The forest scenes lean into greens and browns, with cool shadows that suggest moisture and decay. The arena introduces warmer tones, torchlight orange, and the dusty beige of sunbaked stone. Dragan's palace includes richer reds and golds, signaling wealth extracted from conquest. The mountain stronghold where the rebels gather has a bleached, harsh quality, all exposed rock and unforgiving sunlight. These color choices aren't arbitrary. They guide the audience's emotional response to each location and reinforce the thematic associations tied to those spaces. Camera movement choices also reveal character dynamics. When Sonja moves through the forest, the camera often follows her from behind or beside, adopting her perspective and making her movements feel instinctive. In the arena, the camera sometimes adopts high angles that emphasize how exposed and surrounded the fighters are, trapped in a space designed for spectacle. During quieter character moments, the camera pulls back, allowing space for actors to communicate through posture and gesture rather than relying solely on dialogue. Bassett's direction trusts stillness as much as kinetic action, understanding that both are necessary for a complete emotional palette. The use of natural light wherever possible adds authenticity to outdoor scenes. Rather than blasting every exterior with artificial fill light to ensure perfect visibility, the film embraces the contrast between sunlit areas and shadow. This creates compositions with depth figures silhouetted against bright backgrounds, faces half-lit by firelight, environments where darkness actually obscures detail. That approach increases immersion. Viewers unconsciously register when lighting feels artificial, even if they can't articulate why. By keeping light sources motivated and natural, the film avoids breaking the spell of its world. Visual effects work focuses on integration rather than spectacle. The digital enhancements, extending set boundaries, adding atmospheric effects like dust and smoke, animating creature elements, are calibrated to match the practical photography. There's no jarring shift in image quality when a CGI element enters frame. This restraint serves the film's grounded tone. Flashy VFX showcases would undermine the emphasis on physical struggle and material consequences. Instead, the effects team supports the story invisibly, making the impossible feel plausible within the world's established rules. Stunt coordination deserves recognition for the fight choreography's blend of brutality and clarity. Sonja's combat style is efficient rather than showy strikes, aimed at vulnerable points, movements designed to end fights quickly rather than prolong them for dramatic effect. That efficiency reflects her character. She's not performing for an audience, she's trying to survive and win. The choreography also incorporates grappling and environmental interaction, showing fighters using terrain, grabbing weapons from the ground, and responding to injuries mid-battle. These details make fights feel like actual struggles rather than rehearsed dances. The decision to embrace practical blood effects over digital blood splatters reinforces the visceral impact of violence. Practical blood has weight, texture, and behavior that digital alternatives often lack. It pools, drips, and stains in ways that the eye recognizes as physically accurate. When characters are covered in gore after prolonged fighting, the makeup work ensures it looks like accumulated damage rather than a fresh coat applied between takes. This attention to consistency matters for maintaining immersion during extended action sequences. Bassett's direction also demonstrates restraint in knowing when not to show violence explicitly. While the film earns its R rating through cumulative brutality, it doesn't linger pornographically on suffering. The camera witnesses consequences without fetishizing them. That balance allows the violence to serve the story rather than becoming the story. The audience understands the stakes and the costs without the film devolving into torture porn. It's a fine line, and the creative team navigates it by keeping violence purposeful rather than gratuitous. All these technical elements converge to create a fantasy world that feels tactile and dangerous. The film's craft serves its themes, a story about people reclaiming agency in a system designed to reduce them to commodities, benefits from a visual and sonic approach that emphasizes the material, the physical, and the immediate. Every choice, from the decision to shoot on location to the percussion-heavy score to the R-rated depiction of violence, reinforces the idea that this is a world where actions have weight, where nothing comes easily, and where survival demands constant, exhausting effort. In a genre often dominated by CGI spectacle and sanitized action, Red Sonja's technical approach feels almost countercultural. It insists that fantasy doesn't require polish to be effective. Sometimes mud, blood, and shadow communicate more truth than 1,000 perfectly rendered digital landscapes. The craft behind the film doesn't announce itself with flashy bravado. It works quietly, building a world that viewers can believe in not because it's beautiful, but because it feels real enough to hurt. At its foundation, Red Sonja is a film about what happens when people are treated as instruments rather than individuals. Dragan's empire operates on a simple logic. Everything and everyone exists to serve his consolidation of power. Exotic creatures are ripped from their habitats and forced to perform in deadly games. Slaves are pitted against each other for public amusement. Even Annisia, his most trusted weapon, is revealed to be a victim of deliberate mental sabotage, engineered to make her more controllable. The film interrogates systems where exploitation isn't an unfortunate byproduct. It's the foundational principle. Ws. Sonja's entire arc pushes against that logic. From the moment she attacks the mercenaries poaching creatures in her forest, she positions herself against the idea that strength gives you the right to dominate. Her resistance isn't rooted in abstract philosophy, it's visceral, born from watching her homeland destroyed and her people scattered. When she later frees the Cyclops from its control device and turns it against the arena's masters, she's enacting a kind of poetic justice, the tools of oppression redirected toward liberation. That gesture encapsulates one of the film's central arguments. Power structures are only as strong as the obedience they can compel, and the moment that obedience breaks, the system becomes vulnerable. The Gladiator arena functions as a microcosm of the Empire's broader social contract. Citizens are entertained by watching captives kill each other, which keeps them distracted from their own subordination. The fighters internalize their powerlessness until someone like Sonja demonstrates that rebellion is possible. The crowd's bloodlust depends on the illusion that the violence they witness is contained, controlled, and ultimately harmless to them. Sonja's disruption shatters that illusion. When the Cyclops turns on Dragan's guards instead of the designated target, the audience sees that the mechanisms of control can fail. That realization is dangerous for any authoritarian system. It plants the idea that the status quo is not inevitable. The holy book Dragan pursues represents another facet of how power legitimizes itself. Physical force can conquer territory and coerce obedience, but spiritual authority offers something deeper, the sense that domination is divinely ordained. Dragan doesn't just want to rule through fear, he wants to rule with the blessing of sacred texts, transforming military might into theological mandate. The film's treatment of this artifact is interesting because it never confirms whether the book actually possesses supernatural power. What matters is that Dragan believes it does, and that belief drives him to pursue it obsessively even as his empire crumbles. The text becomes a symbol of the story's power tells itself to justify its existence. Sonja's relationship with Ashera offers a competing vision of spiritual authority. Her goddess doesn't demand conquest or domination. Ashera is associated with forests, natural cycles, and a kind of balance that respects the autonomy of living things. When the goddess intervenes to resurrect Sonja, the mandate she gives is clear but not prescriptive: bring justice to evildoers. That's not a command to establish theocratic rule or forcibly convert others. It's permission to act according to Sonja's own understanding of what balance requires. The contrast between Dragan's imperial theology and Sonja's animistic faith maps onto the broader conflict between systems that extract and those that sustain. The escaped fighters insist on staying with her even when she tries to leave. The Hyrkanians choose to fight alongside her despite knowing the risks. These moments build toward a thematic argument. Individual heroism might spark rebellion, but lasting change requires solidarity. The film doesn't romanticize this process. Building trust among traumatized people is messy, conflict-ridden, and often inefficient. But the alternative, isolated individuals picked off one by one, leads only to extinction. Gender dynamics operate quietly beneath the surface. Sonia exists in a world where physical strength determines survival, and she refuses to perform femininity in ways that would make her vulnerable. Her power doesn't come from magical gifts or royal birthright. It comes from skill, experience, and the willingness to endure pain. The film doesn't frame her gender as either an obstacle to overcome or a source of mystical power. She's simply a person who happens to be a woman, navigating the same brutal world as everyone else. That matter-of-fact approach is more radical than overt feminist messaging would be. It treats female competence as unremarkable rather than exceptional. Annisia's storyline adds a darker dimension to this. Her abuse by Dragan is gendered in specific ways. He manipulates her through promises of romantic partnership, destroys her mental stability to make her dependent, and uses her as a weapon while denying her full personhood. The revelation that her schizophrenia was induced by fake medicines Dragan provided under the guise of care is a particularly insidious betrayal. It turns medical authority and intimate partnership into tools of control. Annisia's inability to escape this dynamic before it destroys her reflects the grim reality that not every victim of systemic abuse finds a path to freedom. Some are consumed by the very systems designed to break them. The film also grapples with the ethics of revenge versus justice. Sonia's motivation is personal. Her people were slaughtered, her homeland destroyed. She has every emotional justification for wanting Dragan dead. Yet the narrative complicates simple vengeance by showing how his cruelty ripples outward, creating concentric circles of suffering that extend far beyond her personal grievance. The enslaved fighters, the captured creatures, the towns forced to supply his war machine, all of them exist in the shadow of his regime. By the time Sonia leads an army against him, the fight has expanded beyond personal vendetta into something closer to revolutionary war. Justice, in this context, means dismantling structures, not just killing individuals. The ending's refusal to deliver clean closure reinforces this thematic complexity. Dragan escapes, wounded but alive. There's no climactic duel where Sonia beheads him in front of his defeated army. That absence is deliberate. It suggests that tyranny isn't contained in a single body that can be eliminated to restore balance. Even with Dragan gone, the systems that enabled his rise remain. The arena still stands. The cities he controlled still function. The survivors of his regime must decide how to rebuild without simply reproducing the hierarchies that caused the suffering in the first place. The film's conclusion acknowledges that winning battles doesn't automatically solve systemic problems. Religious and spiritual themes interweave with political ones. Sonia's faith in Ashera isn't separate from her resistance, it's the foundation of it. Her goddess represents values diametrically opposed to Dragan's imperial theology. Where he seeks dominion, Ashera offers stewardship. Where he demands submission, she asks for balance. When Sonia is resurrected, the divine intervention doesn't solve her problems for her. It gives her another chance to make choices, to continue acting according to her convictions. The film treats faith as something that empowers moral action rather than replacing it. Prayer and ritual don't substitute for struggle, they sustain those who struggle. The cost of resistance is never romanticized. Characters die brutally and often. The Hyrkanians who join Sonia's cause are largely wiped out. The victory at the end is partial and Pyrrhic. The rebels survive, but they've lost irreplaceable people and cultural continuity. The film doesn't pretend that fighting back guarantees winning, or that winning erases the losses incurred along the way. This thematic honesty gives weight to every choice characters make. When someone decides to stand with Sonia, they're not signing up for a guaranteed triumph. They're choosing to resist knowing it might cost them everything. There's also a subtle environmental theme woven through Sonia's connection to the forest and her worship of Ashera. The natural world isn't just scenery, it's portrayed as sacred, deserving of protection from extractive exploitation. Dragan's mercenaries ripping creatures from their habitats mirrors real-world environmental destruction, where ecosystems are treated as resources to be harvested rather than systems to be respected. Sonia's defense of the forest operates on both spiritual and ecological levels. She's protecting not just a place of worship, but the intricate web of life that makes that place meaningful. The film doesn't belabor this point with heavy-handed messaging, but is present in the way natural spaces are filmed and the reverence Sonia shows toward them. The theme of identity and cultural survival resonates through Sonia's search for other Hyrkanians. She spent years believing her people were essentially extinct. Maintaining their traditions alone is an act of defiance against total erasure. Discovering that others survive forces her to reconsider what cultural continuity means. It's not about preserving some frozen, idealized past. It's about living people carrying forward practices, stories, and values while adapting to new circumstances. When the Hyrkanians are largely killed in the final battle, that loss is portrayed as more than a tactical setback. It's cultural genocide in miniature. Another generation cut down, another portion of collective memory silenced. The survivors who remain carry the burden of deciding what to preserve and what to let evolve. Naughty nice, naughty madness and manipulation form another thematic strand through Annisia's arc. Her mental illness is not presented as inherent weakness or villainy. It's the result of deliberate sabotage by someone who weaponized her vulnerability. The film makes a distinction between mental illness as a condition people live with and mental illness as a tool of control used by abusers. Annisia's tragedy is that she never gets the chance to exist outside the framework Dragan constructed around her. Even her final act of turning on him is framed not as redemption but as one last, futile assertion of agency before both of them bleed out. It's a bleak commentary on how power can hollow out a person from the inside, leaving only rage and confusion in place of a coherent self-gt. Throughout all these thematic threads, the film maintains a core conviction: the struggle against oppressive systems is worth undertaking even when victory is uncertain and the costs are devastating. Sonia and her allies don't fight because they're guaranteed to win. They fight because the alternative, accepting subjugation, watching their cultures erased, allowing the strong to devour the weak unchallenged, is spiritually intolerable. The thematic architecture of Red Sonja builds toward an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Freedom isn't given, it's seized, and the people who seize it often don't survive to enjoy it. What they do is make space for those who come after them, proving through their sacrifice that resistance is possible. In the end, the film's thematic richness comes from its refusal to simplify the moral landscape. It doesn't pretend that righteous causes automatically produce righteous outcomes or that personal virtue shields anyone from systemic violence. Instead, it maps a world where people make choices based on partial information, conflicting loyalties, and the weight of their own trauma. Some of those choices lead to survival, others lead to death. But all of them matter because they shape the world that emerges from the ashes of conflict. That's the real legacy Sonia leaves, not a perfect world, but one where people know that chains can be broken, even if breaking them costs everything. Red Sonja arrived in 2025 burdened by decades of expectation and false starts. Since the original 1985 film starring Brigitte Nielsen became a cult curiosity for all the wrong reasons, various attempts to reboot the character collapsed before reaching production. Hannah John Kamen was initially cast with Joey Soloway directing, but the project underwent extensive creative retooling before MJ Bassett and Matilda Lutz eventually took the reins. That turbulent development cycle could have resulted in a compromised product shaped by too many competing visions. Instead, the final film demonstrates a surprising coherence of purpose, suggesting that the extended gestation period allowed the creative team to refine exactly what story they wanted to tell. The release strategy itself reflected the realities of independent fantasy filmmaking in 2025. Samuel Goldwyn Films distributed the movie in the United States with a limited theatrical release, essentially a single-day event, on August 13, 2025, before transitioning to video-on-demand platforms by August 29. Signature Entertainment handled UK and Irish rights through similar channels. This approach bypassed the traditional wide theatrical model entirely, treating cinemas as a launch platform rather than the primary revenue stream. For a gritty R-rated fantasy without major studio backing, the strategy made economic sense even if it limited the film's cultural footprint. Why? Critical reception split along predictable fault lines. Reviewers who appreciated the film's commitment to brutal, practical action praised Matilda Lutz's physical performance and the movie's willingness to embrace consequences. Those less impressed argued that, beneath the blood and spectacle, the plot followed familiar sword and sorcery beats without reinventing the genre. Both assessments contain validity. Red Sonja doesn't revolutionize fantasy storytelling structurally. What it does is execute familiar narrative frameworks with craft and conviction often missing from larger budget attempts. The question becomes whether competent, visceral genre work is sufficient, or whether audiences in 2025 demand constant innovation. The film's IMDb rating of 4.6 suggests a deeply divided audience response. That score sits uncomfortably low for a film with genuine production values and committed performances, indicating either that expectations were misaligned with what the film delivered, or that the limited release prevented it from finding its natural audience. Cult fantasy films often struggle initially before finding appreciation through home video and streaming platforms. Whether Red Sonja follows that trajectory or fades into the crowded field of forgotten adaptations remains to be seen. But the ingredients for cult rediscovery are present: strong practical action, an R-rated willingness to go dark, and a central performance that takes the material seriously. Box office performance is difficult to assess given the non-traditional release model, but the quick pivot to digital platforms suggests theatrical revenues were never the primary financial strategy. In an era where streaming services have conditioned audiences to wait for home release, niche genre films face diminishing returns from theatrical exclusivity windows. The economics of fantasy filmmaking have shifted dramatically. What once required massive theatrical success to recoup costs can now potentially break even through international licensing, digital rentals, and eventual platform acquisitions. Red Sonja's financial viability likely depends more on long-tail streaming metrics than opening weekend grosses. Except. Culturally, the film enters a fantasy landscape already saturated with high-budget spectacle. The success of Game of Thrones and its various imitators established audience appetite for morally complex, violent fantasy storytelling. The Marvel Cinematic Universe normalized mythology, heavy narratives with massive budgets and interconnected storylines. Against those juggernauts, a standalone sword and sorcery film with modest resources faces visibility challenges. Red Sonja can't compete on scale, so it competes on specificity, offering a focused, character-driven story without the obligation to set up sequels or build franchises. That self-contained quality is both limitation and strength. The film's approach to its source material navigates a tricky balance. Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age stories and Roy Thomas's comic book adaptations carry both devoted fans and significant cultural baggage. The 1985 film's camp sensibility and the character's often sexualized depiction in comics created expectations. This version deliberately subverts. Matilda Lutz's Sonia is functional and fierce rather than posed for male gaze consumption. Her costume prioritizes mobility over decoration. Her motivations are rooted in trauma and spiritual conviction rather than romantic subplots. That recalibration aligns with contemporary sensibilities while respecting the character's core identity as an uncompromising warrior. Compared to other recent fantasy adaptations, Red Sonja occupies a specific niche. It lacks the polish of big studio productions, but offers rawness those films avoid. It doesn't aspire to the epic scope of Peter Jackson's Middle-earth films or Denis Villeneuve's Dune, instead focusing on a smaller-scale conflict with higher personal stakes. In some ways, it has more in common with television fantasy like The Witcher or Wheel of Time, grounded world-building, emphasis on practical effects, willingness to embrace mature themes. The difference is budget and runtime. Where those shows develop ideas over seasons, Red Sonja compresses its narrative into a single feature, which requires ruthless efficiency in storytelling. The performance of Matilda Lutz deserves specific attention as a key variable in the film's reception. Lutz, previously known for roles in Rings and Revenge, commits fully to the physical demands of the role. Her Sonia moves with the learned economy of someone who spent years surviving through combat. She doesn't perform strength, she embodies it through posture, gait, and the way she handles weapons. That physicality grounds the character in a way that makes the more fantastical elements, divine resurrection, mythological creatures, feel connected to a tangible reality. When critics praised the film, Lutz's performance was frequently cited as a stabilizing element that held disparate tonal pieces together. The supporting cast's contributions also shaped reception. Robert Sheehan's Dragan walks a fine line between imperious authority and desperate scheming, making him more than a cardboard villain. Wallace Day's portrayal of Annisia navigates the challenging task of depicting mental illness without caricature, giving the character tragic depth despite limited screen time. The ensemble of escaped fighters, played by actors including Rona Mitra, Michael Bisping, and Martin Ford, bring enough distinct personality that they register as individuals rather than generic rebels. That character work prevents the rebellion storyline from feeling abstract or populated by interchangeable soldiers. Nijay Bassett's direction receives mixed evaluation depending on what critics prioritize. Those focused on action choreography and practical filmmaking generally praised her work, noting the clarity of fight scenes and effective use of locations. Critics more interested in narrative innovation found the plot predictable despite its brutal execution. Bassett's strength lies in genre competence rather than auteur reinvention. She understands how sword and sorcery should feel, urgent, physical, grounded in consequence, and executes that vision with professionalism. Whether that's enough depends on whether viewers value craft within genre conventions or demand constant subversion of those conventions. The film's gender politics invite scrutiny given the character's history. Red Sonja began as a female counterpart to Conan in the 1970s, and her comic book portrayals have oscillated between empowerment iconography and exploitation imagery. The 2025 film sidesteps most of these pitfalls by treating Sonja as a warrior first, rather than constantly commenting on her gender. She isn't surrounded by men who doubt her abilities only to be proven wrong through repetitive demonstrations. She's simply competent, and competence is recognized by allies without fanfare. The film's feminist credentials, such as they are, come from refusing to make gender an obstacle Sonja must overcome in every scene. She has plenty of real obstacles: trauma, empire, impossible odds, without adding performative sexism as narrative filler. The R rating proves both asset and limitation. It allows the film to depict violence with consequence, which serves the thematic emphasis on the cost of resistance. Blood that actually looks like blood, wounds that don't heal instantly, and deaths that aren't sanitized all contribute to the story's emotional weight. However, the rating also limits potential audience size, excluding younger viewers and making marketing more challenging. For a character derived from pulp fantasy with broad cultural name recognition, that trade-off is significant. The creative team clearly decided that tonal authenticity mattered more than market reach, a choice that defines the film's identity for better or worse. In terms of franchise potential, Red Sonja's ending leaves room for continuation while functioning as a complete story. Dragan's escape into the wilderness could theoretically fuel a sequel focused on hunting him down. The surviving rebels and Hyrkanians face the challenge of rebuilding, which offers narrative possibilities. However, the film's financial performance and reception make sequels unlikely in the traditional sense. If the property continues, it might be through reboots or different media rather than direct follow-ups. That uncertainty is endemic to mid-budget fantasy in the current market. Success is measured in survival rather than franchise launches. The film's relationship to nostalgia is complicated. On one hand, it revives a character dormant in cinema for 40 years, appealing to fans who remember the comics or even the 1985 film. On the other hand, it deliberately breaks from the campy tone and sexualized imagery of those earlier incarnations. The result is a movie that bears the name Red Sonja without necessarily delivering what older fans might expect. That tension plays out in online reception, where some viewers appreciate the grounded reimagining while others lament the loss of the exaggerated pulp aesthetic. Neither position is wrong, they simply value different aspects of the source material. Streaming and digital platforms offer Red Sonja a potential second life. Films that underperform theatrically often find dedicated audiences through home viewing, where viewers can discover them without the pressure of theatrical ticket prices. The movie's brutal action and thematic depth reward rewatching in ways that disposable blockbusters don't. As it circulates through various digital storefronts and potentially lands on subscription services, it may accumulate the kind of slow-burn appreciation that defines cult classics. That process takes years rather than weeks, making immediate assessments of the film's legacy premature. The production's international locations, Bulgaria and Greece, contributed to a visual aesthetic distinct from the generic medieval Europe look of many fantasy films. Those landscapes bring specific textures, the way light hits Mediterranean stone, the particular vegetation of Eastern European forests, the weather patterns that shape outdoor scenes. These details might not register consciously for most viewers, but they contribute to a sense that the film's world exists beyond the edges of the frame. Location shooting grounds, fantasy and physical reality, giving even magical elements a material anchor. Ultimately, Red Sonja, 2025, occupies an interesting position in the fantasy genre ecosystem. It's neither big enough to dominate cultural conversation nor obscure enough to be easily dismissed. It represents a specific approach to fantasy filmmaking, practical, violent, character-focused, thematically engaged, that exists in tension with both high-budget spectacle and low-budget exploitation. Its legacy will depend less on immediate commercial success and more on whether it finds an audience that values what it does well: grounded action, committed performances, and a willingness to let its story end without reassuring platitudes about justice or closure. The film doesn't reinvent fantasy cinema. It reminds audiences what the genre can accomplish when craft, conviction, and a clear thematic vision align. In an era of disposable content and algorithmic entertainment, that focused intentionality might be enough to give Red Sonja staying power beyond its modest theatrical moment. Only time will reveal whether it fades as another failed reboot or grows into a cult favorite discovered by successive waves of viewers seeking fantasy that cuts deeper than polish and spectacle alone can reach.